The recap opens in Tampa, Florida, where a weapons transaction is being arranged in a grimy backroom. A nervous low-level criminal named Mickey escorts young Bobby Saint to meet a man called Otto, a smooth-talking broker who proudly mentions he can speak 6 different languages, which explains his unusual accent. The buyers seem interested, the cash is ready, and for a moment the deal appears to be going according to plan. Then everything collapses in seconds when FBI agents suddenly storm the location. Panic erupts instantly. Otto reacts first, pulling a gun as agents open fire across the room. Bullets tear through the warehouse, dropping almost everyone involved. Mickey, terrified beyond reason, dives for cover while watching Bobby get caught in the crossfire and killed. By the time the shooting stops, the entire operation is a massacre, leaving Mickey as one of the few survivors trembling in shock beside Bobby's body. As authorities begin removing the corpses, something unexpected happens. Otto quietly gets back to his feet completely unharmed. The fake accent disappears from his voice as he casually complains about how exhausting undercover assignments have become. The truth comes out. Otto Krieg never existed. The man is actually Frank Castle, an FBI operative finishing his final assignment before retirement. Even though the mission succeeded, Frank is disturbed by the death of the young man who got caught in the middle of it all. Not long afterward, investigators identify the dead victim as Robert Bobby Saint, son of powerful crime boss Howard Saint. News of Bobby's death spreads quickly through the Saint family empire. Howard's other son, Johnny, immediately arranges for Mickey to be released from custody. Instead of freedom, Mickey is dragged to the Saints' nightclub, where he's brutally beaten and interrogated. Terrified and bloodied, he tries explaining that Bobby insisted on attending the deal himself and that Otto supposedly died during the raid too. But his excuses mean little to the furious family. Howard Saint remains cold and unconvinced. To make an example out of someone, he executes another man responsible for Bobby's security right in front of Mickey, proving exactly how merciless he can be. Mickey begs for mercy, asking them not to ruin his face if they plan to kill him because of his mother. The scene only reinforces the fear surrounding the Saint family and the absolute control Howard holds over everyone beneath him. Elsewhere, Frank reunites with his wife Maria and their young son after finally finishing his long FBI career. He admits he's spent years dragging them from place to place because of his dangerous work, but promises things are about to change. London, he says, will be their final move, somewhere safe where the family can finally settle down together. Before starting that new life, though, the entire Castle family plans a large reunion trip to Puerto Rico. Meanwhile, Howard Saint personally visits the morgue to see Bobby's body for himself. When local authorities refuse to share details about the undercover agent involved in the operation, Howard turns to his own criminal network. He orders his people to uncover every piece of information possible about Otto. Soon enough, Quentin Glass discovers the truth and informs Howard that Otto was merely an alias. The man responsible is FBI agent Frank Castle. Howard immediately decides Frank must die, but his wife Livia pushes things even further. She insists revenge should not stop with Frank alone. His entire bloodline should be wiped out. Howard agrees without hesitation. Johnny volunteers to personally oversee the hit and heads to Puerto Rico, alongside a team of armed assassins. The killers arrive while the Castle family is gathered outside, enjoying a large beach celebration. Frank happens to be indoors with his father, looking through a collection of firearms when distant gunshots suddenly echo across the property. Realizing something is terribly wrong, they rush to arm themselves and fight back. But the attackers are everywhere. Chaos tears through the reunion. Family members are gunned down one after another, while Frank and his father desperately try to hold the assassins off. Maria manages to escape with their son in a vehicle and races away from the slaughter, hoping to survive long enough to get help. But the assassins pursue them relentlessly before finally smashing directly into their car and killing them both. Frank becomes trapped in a violent knife fight and arrives moments too late to save his wife and child. All he can do is stare helplessly at their lifeless bodies. Before he can react, the assassins return once more. Johnny personally beats Frank savagely before shooting him, coldly delivering a message from Howard and Livia Saint. Believing the job finished, Quentin sets the entire place ablaze, leaving Frank inside to burn alongside the rest of his family. What they fail to realize is that the explosion throws Frank's body into the ocean rather than killing him. Back at the Saints and Sinners Club, Howard and his people celebrate what they believe is complete revenge. Livia receives an expensive pair of diamond earrings from Howard as a gift marking the occasion, while everyone drinks and congratulates themselves for erasing the Castle family. On the shoreline of Puerto Rico, however, Frank is discovered alive by Candelaria, an old friend connected to the Castle family. Barely clinging to life, Frank is carried back to recover. Once he regains his strength, he returns to the ruins of his family home. Among the ashes, he gathers several weapons his father had shown him earlier, along with a black shirt decorated with a white skull, a gift from his son. Completely consumed by grief and rage, Frank decides revenge is the only thing left for him. He returns to the United States and disappears into a decaying, poverty-stricken neighborhood. There, he quietly begins transforming himself into something far more dangerous. He modifies firearms, reinforces his apartment, and customizes his car while living in near isolation. His strange behavior quickly attracts attention from the people nearby. Bumpo, an eccentric man obsessed with opera music, Spacker Dave, a jittery guy covered in piercings, and Joan, a lonely woman worn down by life but still kind-hearted. One night, Frank abducts Mickey and drags him into his apartment for questioning. He threatens to burn him alive unless he reveals everything he knows about Howard Saint's operation. Mickey initially refuses, terrified that talking will get him killed by the Saints. Frank then stages a fake torture session using a frozen ice pop against Mickey's skin, making him believe he's being burned alive. Mickey screams so loudly that the entire building is disturbed, leaving Frank's neighbors horrified by the noises coming from inside the apartment. Finally broken by fear, Mickey starts talking. He explains that Howard Saint's criminal empire depends heavily on two Cuban brothers who oversee gambling and prostitution operations throughout the Gulf Coast. According to Mickey, all the profits eventually flow back to Howard, who launders the money through banking connections in the Grand Cayman Islands. Frank eventually lets Mickey go, and the terrified crook quickly realizes the burns and torture were only a bluff. Once he understands he was never truly harmed, his fear shifts into resentment toward the Saints. Bitter about the way they treated him, Mickey starts speaking freely, revealing details about Howard Saint's operations, daily routines, and most trusted associate, Quentin Glass. Using that information, Frank begins quietly stalking the Saint family from a distance. Armed with a camera and endless patience, he studies every detail of their lives. He tracks Howard's regular golf outings, memorizes Livia's evenings at the movies, and uncovers secrets surrounding Quentin's hidden personal life. Piece by piece, Frank builds a psychological map of the entire organization before making his next move. Not long afterward, Frank publicly confronts several former police colleagues outside a station while reporters surround them with cameras rolling. Furious that nobody has been punished for the slaughter of his family, he demands answers. The officers awkwardly admit that nobody wants to challenge Howard Saint because of the power and fear he commands throughout the city. Realizing the system is too intimidated to act, Frank understands he's completely on his own. So he decides to wage war personally. Frank infiltrates one of Saint's banking operations and storms inside armed. He forces terrified employees to stuff huge amounts of cash into a suitcase, while the rest of the money is tossed out the windows onto the street below. Crowds immediately gather as bills rain from the building, creating total chaos outside, while Frank slips away unnoticed. During the operation, he also tracks down two of Howard's hired killers and eliminates them before disappearing into the commotion. News of the robbery spreads rapidly across the city. Back at the apartment complex, Bumpo and Spacker Dave search through information about Frank and slowly begin realizing the quiet man living near them is far more dangerous than he appears. Howard Saint, meanwhile, explodes with rage over the stolen money and dead enforcers. Matters only get worse when the Cuban brothers financing much of his operation warn him that if more money disappears, they'll take their business elsewhere. Howard promises them everything is under control, but the pressure building around him is starting to show. Back at the apartment building, another incident unfolds late one night. A drunk and aggressive man pounds on Joan's door, demanding she let him inside. Bumpo and Spacker are too intimidated to intervene, but Frank calmly steps in. Without hesitation, he brutally punches the man several times and drives him away from the building. Joan is stunned by what she's just witnessed. Nobody had ever defended her before, and for the first time she begins seeing Frank as more than the mysterious stranger next door. At the same time, Frank's larger revenge plan continues taking shape. He secretly breaks into Livia Saint's car and uses her phone to contact Quentin Glass. Disguising his intentions, he warns Quentin to visit the Winton Hotel if he wants to retrieve compromising photographs that Howard Saint would never forgive. Before leaving, Frank deliberately parks Livia's car illegally near the hotel, ensuring it receives a parking ticket that places her there. Later, Howard asks around looking for Quentin and is casually informed by Mickey that Quentin had supposedly been seen at the Winton Hotel. Soon after, Howard notices Quentin and Livia speaking privately together and laughing. The moment is harmless, but thanks to Frank's manipulation, suspicion quietly begins growing in Howard's mind. Quentin dismisses the situation when questioned, yet Howard's unease lingers. The following day, Frank visits the small cafe where Joan works. While eating, an odd man carrying a guitar walks in and begins singing directly to him. The stranger introduces himself as Harry Heck and calmly explains that the song he's performing is meant for Frank's funeral. Immediately recognizing the threat, Frank quietly leaves the cafe before trouble starts. Once outside, Harry launches his attack. While Frank is driving, Harry suddenly ambushes him and opens fire, believing he has him trapped. But Frank had already reinforced the interior of his vehicle with hidden armor plating, preventing the bullets from penetrating. A violent high-speed chase tears through the streets afterward, with Harry relentlessly pursuing him. During the chase, Frank swerves to avoid hitting a little girl and crashes badly. Harry catches up and prepares to finish him off. But before he can pull the trigger, Frank counters with a knife and kills him in brutal fashion. Later that night, Frank targets another major shipment of Saint money being transported by boat. Johnny Saint personally oversees the operation, alongside heavily armed guards. Everything seems secure until Johnny discovers a bomb on board carrying the chilling message. Front toward enemy. Realizing the danger at the last second, Johnny leaps into the water moments before the vessel explodes in a massive fireball. The blast destroys the entire cash shipment, while Frank watches silently from a nearby hill, making sure Johnny sees him standing there. Howard's empire begins spiraling further out of control. Back at his headquarters, Howard smashes furniture and loses his temper completely, while the furious Cuban brothers storm into his office, demanding compensation for their losses. Howard refuses to repay them, claiming their criminal partnership came without guarantees or insurance. He warns them not to push him, boasting that he still has more firepower than anyone else in the city. But after they leave, it becomes obvious the threat was mostly desperation and bluffing. Out of options and willing to escalate things further, Howard orders Quentin to contact a man known only as the Russian. Meanwhile, life in the apartment building briefly softens around Frank. Spacker Dave nervously asks him for help because Joan's abusive ex has returned to her apartment again. Frank initially shuts the door in his face, trying to distance himself emotionally from the people around him. But seconds later, he changes his mind and walks over to Joan's apartment. Instead of violence, he finds Joan, Bumpo, and Spacker preparing dinner together. They invite him to sit with them, and for once Frank experiences something resembling a normal evening. Before eating, everyone shares what they're thankful for. The moment feels strangely warm and genuine compared to the darkness consuming Frank's life. Joan gently encourages him to hold on to good memories instead of allowing tragedy and anger to define him forever. Frank quietly admits he isn't the kind of man she thinks he is and leaves before getting emotionally attached. Trying to lift Joan's mood afterward, Bumpo and Spacker put on loud opera music, dance around the apartment, and prepare dessert. The joyful noise fills the building just as chaos erupts next door. Inside Frank's apartment, the Russian arrives. The massive assassin crashes into the room and immediately engages Frank in a savage hand-to-hand battle. Furniture shatters, walls crack, and the fight becomes increasingly brutal as the two men tear through the apartment with almost superhuman force. The opera music from the neighboring room partially masks the sounds of destruction, while the fight spills from one apartment into another. Joan and the others are horrified when the battle suddenly bursts into their living space. Despite being badly overpowered physically, Frank refuses to quit. The fight finally ends when he scalds the Russian with boiling water and manages to kill him after a vicious struggle. Bruised, bloodied, and barely able to stand, Frank collapses from exhaustion, while Joan, Bumpo, and Spacker rush to help patch up his injuries. At the same time, Howard Saint's men eventually locate the massive body of the Russian inside the ruined apartment building. Armed enforcers quickly flood the area searching for Frank. Before they arrive, Joan helps Frank disappear into a hidden underground compartment, while Bumpo and Spacker Dave stay upstairs to stall the attackers and protect him. Quentin Glass personally leads the interrogation. He questions Bumpo and Spacker aggressively, desperate to uncover Frank's location. When Spacker refuses to cooperate, Quentin brutally tortures him by ripping out his facial piercings one by one. The pain is unbearable, but Spacker still insists he knows nothing. Eventually, Quentin becomes convinced the two are telling the truth. Before leaving, he stations one of his men outside the apartment with orders to report back if Frank returns. Once the coast is clear and Frank recovers enough strength to move, he silently eliminates the guard left behind. Afterwards, confused by the loyalty shown toward him, he asks Spacker why he risked suffering for someone he barely knows. Spacker simply replies that neighbors are supposed to look after each other, and that makes them family. Bumpo later takes the injured Spacker to the hospital, while Frank once again prepares for war. Joan, however, is deeply shaken by everything she has witnessed. Looking at the weapons and violence surrounding him, she questions how Frank is truly different from Howard Saint and his killers. Frank gives her a cold answer. Unlike the Saints, they still have something left they're afraid to lose. The response makes Joan realize something darker. Part of Frank no longer cares whether he survives this revenge mission at all. Deep down, he's expecting to die in the process. Still committed to destroying Howard psychologically before killing him physically, Frank sets the next stage of his plan into motion. He secretly sneaks into Livia Saint's car once again and carefully recreates the same setup involving Quentin Glass. Under Frank's instructions, Mickey later discovers the parking ticket from the Winton Hotel inside Livia's vehicle and deliberately shows it to Howard. Immediately, Howard remembers Quentin being connected to that exact location earlier. The seeds of paranoia Frank planted finally begin taking root. Consumed by suspicion, Howard heads directly toward Quentin's home. Meanwhile, Frank breaks into the house moments before Howard arrives. Once inside, Frank quietly rearranges certain details, making it appear as though Quentin and Livia have been secretly involved with each other. When Howard eventually enters the house, he notices one of Livia's diamond earrings lying beside Quentin's bed. Not long afterward, Quentin returns home completely unaware of the danger waiting for him. Howard greets him calmly at first while standing near the staircase, but there's something deeply unsettling in his voice. He begins telling Quentin a story about how a jealous man can manipulate another person into believing infidelity by entering their house, moving furniture around, and leaving behind small clues designed to spark suspicion. As he speaks, Howard deliberately shifts Quentin's furniture and throws a knife onto the table between them, recreating the exact scenario he's describing. Then the questioning begins. Howard asks where Quentin and Livia plan to meet next. Quentin denies everything and insists he has never betrayed Howard in any way, especially not for money. Howard laughs bitterly, claiming Quentin has always been a convincing liar. When Quentin hesitates to pick up the knife lying on the table, Howard suddenly snaps. Feeling humiliated and betrayed by the man he considered a brother, he attacks Quentin in a violent rage and stabs him to death. A short time later, Livia returns home only to discover her belongings scattered across the floor. Howard confronts her immediately, accusing her of sleeping with Quentin. When she notices Quentin's corpse near the doorway and sees the Winton Hotel ticket, she desperately tries explaining the truth. Quentin was gay, and there was never any affair between them. Howard refuses to believe a word she says. Blinded by jealousy and manipulation, he slaps her and drags her into the car. During the drive, he bitterly reflects on their history together, even bringing up her past before he made her part of his empire. Eventually, they stop on a bridge overlooking railroad tracks below. Without mercy, Howard throws Livia over the side. Seconds later, a speeding train tears through the tracks beneath, killing her instantly. By this point, Frank has completely shattered Howard Saint from the inside. Afterward, Howard returns to his nightclub and offers a massive reward to whichever man succeeds in killing Frank Castle. Inside his office, Johnny asks where Livia and Quentin are, but Howard coldly lies to his own son and avoids answering directly. Elsewhere, Frank prepares for the final confrontation. Armed to the teeth, he approaches the Saints and Sinners Club under cover of darkness. He silently eliminates guards stationed outside, then plants explosives beneath multiple vehicles around the property before sneaking into the building from above. Inside the crowded nightclub, chaos begins subtly. One of the gangsters orders champagne using a small lift system without realizing Frank has hidden a bomb inside the bucket being sent upward. Moments later, the explosive detonates violently. The entire club erupts into panic. As smoke and confusion spread through the building, Frank storms in and starts executing anyone still standing. Gunfire tears through the nightclub while terrified criminals scramble in every direction. During the carnage, Frank finds Johnny trapped and severely wounded. Instead of killing him immediately, Frank forces him to hold onto an explosive device and leaves him there begging not to be abandoned. Frank then continues deeper into the club until he finally comes face to face with Howard Saint himself. Standing before the broken crime boss, Frank reveals that both of Howard's sons are dead. In the background, Johnny's terrified screams echo through the building moments before the bomb explodes and silences him forever. Frank shoots Howard and then reveals the final truth behind everything that happened. He shows him the fabricated evidence, the photographs suggesting Quentin's affair, along with Livia's missing earring. Howard slowly realizes the horrifying reality. Frank manipulated him into murdering both his closest friend and his own wife with his own hands. And now Frank tells him it's finally his turn. Frank chains Howard by the ankles to the back of a car and drags him across the parking lot while the explosives planted earlier begin detonating one after another. Flames spread outward across the ground in a massive burning pattern shaped like the skull symbol Frank now wears. Howard is dragged helplessly through the inferno as the fire consumes him alive. With his revenge complete, Frank returns home emotionally empty. At his lowest point, he prepares to end his own life and raises a gun toward himself. But just before pulling the trigger, a memory of his wife stops him. The thought changes something inside him. Instead of dying, Frank realizes he still has a purpose beyond revenge. Later, he meets Joan one final time and admits she was right all along. Good memories really can save a person from being swallowed entirely by darkness. Before leaving, Frank tells Joan he has left something behind for her, Bumpo, and Spacker Dave. After Spacker is released from the hospital, the three neighbors discover bundles of stolen cash waiting for them, enough to completely change their lives. In the final moments, Frank stands alone on a bridge as the sun sets behind him. He vows that from now on, anyone who preys upon innocent people, murderers, sadists, rapists, and monsters hiding behind power, will answer to him. Frank Castle, the man who once lived for family and justice, is gone. What remains is the Punisher. One thing that really surprised me revisiting the Punisher from 2004 is how little it actually feels like a superhero movie. And I don't mean that in the modern, grounded comic book film way where everything is dark lighting and sad orchestral music, while characters still save the universe every 20 minutes. I mean this thing genuinely feels closer to an old revenge thriller somebody accidentally stamped a Marvel logo onto. Like, if you removed the skull shirt and changed a few names, this could honestly pass as one of those brutal late-night vigilante movies you'd randomly catch on TV years ago. The DNA feels way more connected to Death Wish or Dirty Harry than it does to something like Spider-Man 2, which came out the exact same year, by the way. That's still weird to think about. In one movie, Marvel gave us Doc Ock throwing trains around New York, and in the other, they gave us Thomas Jane dragging a burning mob boss through a parking lot while cars explode into the shape of a skull. That contrast alone kind of explains why The Punisher has always had this strange reputation, because the movie doesn't really care about being fun in the normal comic book sense. It's angry, mean, honestly. Even when it tries to crack jokes or throw in weird side characters, there's still this bitterness hanging over the whole thing. The atmosphere feels heavy right from the beginning, and it never completely lets go of that feeling. There's no sense that Frank Castle is secretly enjoying being a hero. If anything, the movie treats him like somebody rotting from the inside out, and I think that's why some people really connect with this version, while others absolutely hate it. If you go into this expecting slick superhero spectacle, it can feel kind of awkward and uncomfortable. The movie is too violent to be crowd-pleasing in the normal Marvel way, but it's also too comic booky to fully become the psychological revenge drama it sometimes wants to be. It's stuck in this weird middle space where one scene feels ripped from a grim crime thriller, and the next suddenly has a giant cartoonishly huge assassin crashing through walls. Oddly enough, though, that's part of the charm. Because the film never feels manufactured in the way a lot of modern comic book movies do. Messy, definitely. Uneven, constantly. But it has personality. You can feel the filmmakers pulling from old westerns, revenge cinema, mafia movies, even those gritty 70s and 80s action films where protagonists weren't really heroes anymore. Frank Castle isn't saving innocent people because it's morally right. He's destroying people because he's broken and furious and honestly doesn't know how to exist anymore outside of violence. That's not a very Marvel idea. At least not traditionally, and maybe that's why this movie has aged in such an interesting way. Back in the early 2000s, comic book films were still figuring themselves out. Some leaned campy, some went ultra-serious. Some tried balancing both and collapsed under the weight of it. The Punisher sort of wanders into its own lane entirely. It's not polished enough to sit beside the biggest superhero movies of that era, but it also feels harsher and more personal than most of them. You watch it now, and it almost feels like the missing link between old-school revenge thrillers and the darker comic book adaptations that became popular years later. And honestly, I kind of respect the movie for committing to that identity even when it stumbles, because it stumbles a lot, but at least it swings hard doing it. The setup for The Punisher is honestly way harsher than I remembered. Like, I knew the movie was dark going in, but rewatching it now, the origin story almost feels unnecessarily cruel at points. And I mean that as both criticism and weird praise, because the film absolutely commits to destroying Frank Castle's life in the most brutal way possible. So Frank starts out as this undercover FBI agent wrapping up what's supposed to be his final operation before retirement. Pretty standard setup at first. He's got the family, the respected career, the sense that he's about to finally slow down and enjoy life a little. Of course, because this is the Punisher, the universe basically looks at that happiness and says, yeah, absolutely not. During the operation, a mobster's son named Bobby Saint gets killed. Technically, it's kind of accidental, kind of collateral damage, but none of that matters once John Travolta's Howard Saint finds out. And honestly, I do like that the movie doesn't waste a ton of time overcomplicating the motivation here. Saint wants revenge, that's it. Simple, direct, ugly. But what really pushes the movie into darker territory is how far that revenge goes. Saint doesn't just order Frank killed, he wipes out the entire family. Parents, cousins, children, basically anybody standing near Frank Castle gets erased. And the movie lingers on it too. It's not framed like a quick action movie tragedy where the hero sheds one tear and immediately starts loading guns in slow motion. The whole sequence feels nasty and personal. There's this coldness to it that actually caught me off guard a little, because early 2000s comic book movies usually pulled punches emotionally. This one really doesn't. And I think that massacre scene is probably the most important moment in the entire film, because it completely changes the tone afterward. Once that happens, the movie can't really go back to being a normal superhero story anymore. Frank surviving doesn't feel triumphant. It feels wrong. Like he's the one person who should have died with the rest of them, and now he's stuck wandering around with nothing left except rage. That's really the birth of the Punisher in this version. Not some heroic transformation, not a cool, becoming the symbol moment. It's basically a psychological collapse stretched into a 2-hour revenge movie, and I actually think the film deserves credit for how simple it keeps Frank's motivation after that. There's no complicated moral speech, no grand mission statement about saving society. Frank isn't trying to become a better man. He just wants every single person connected to this massacre gone. What's interesting, though, is that the movie occasionally hints that Frank himself barely cares whether he survives the revenge or not. That's something I didn't fully notice years ago. He doesn't really rebuild his life. He doesn't heal. He just redirects all of his grief into punishment. There's a scene later where people around him try pulling him back toward normal human connection a little, but you can already tell it's too late. The damage is done. And honestly, that's probably why the origin works better than a lot of other comic book revenge stories from that era. It feels ugly enough that you understand why Frank Castle becomes this person, even if you don't necessarily agree with what he turns into afterward. The movie doesn't romanticize the tragedy much either. It's not stylish sadness. It's just loss stacked on top of more loss, until there's basically nothing human left in him except anger. That's the key thing the film understands early on. Frank Castle isn't becoming a superhero here. He's becoming a weapon. One thing the Punisher absolutely nails, even when the movie itself gets messy, is the atmosphere. You feel the tone of this thing almost immediately. It's heavy. Not serious in the fake edgy superhero way, where characters whisper dramatically in rainstorms every 5 minutes. I mean genuinely bitter. The movie feels angry at the world from the start, and honestly, it barely relaxes after that. Even before Frank Castle fully becomes the Punisher, there's already this uncomfortable tension hanging over everything. The colors are muted, the lighting's grimy, people constantly look exhausted or emotionally checked out. It almost feels sweaty at times, like everybody in this world either needs sleep, therapy, or several years away from firearms. What I found interesting rewatching it is how committed the film is to making the violence feel unpleasant instead of exciting. Or at least unpleasant most of the time. Because the movie also has this weird comic book energy bubbling underneath it that occasionally explodes into full absurdity without warning. That's really the strange balancing act of the entire film. One minute it feels like this grounded revenge thriller where grief has completely poisoned a man's soul. Then suddenly you've got exaggerated assassins, weird humor, over-the-top action sequences, and giant wrestling-sized Russians crashing through apartment walls. Somehow the movie keeps bouncing between ugly realism and comic book nonsense, and weirdly, it almost works because of how sincere the movie is about both sides. I don't think the film ever fully figures out the perfect balance, though. There are scenes where the tonal shifts are honestly kind of awkward, like the movie isn't sure if it wants you to laugh, feel disturbed, or cheer. Sometimes it tries doing all three at once, but I'll say this. I'd rather watch a movie struggle with tone while trying something unique than sit through another polished superhero film that feels emotionally manufactured in a lab, because The Punisher definitely has personality. You can feel the influence of old revenge movies all over it, not just in the story, but in the mood. Frank Castle wanders through the movie like one of those old Western antiheroes who already died emotionally before the plot even started. There's almost this dusty loneliness to parts of the film despite it being set in modern Florida. Some scenes honestly feel more like a neo-Western than a comic book adaptation. And then there's the violence itself, which changes the atmosphere completely compared to other Marvel movies from that era. This thing is mean. I keep coming back to that word because it fits. The movie doesn't just want action. It wants punishment. Gunshots aren't clean. Fights aren't heroic. People scream, limp, bleed, panic. Frank himself gets absolutely destroyed physically throughout the movie. He's constantly bruised, battered, half-conscious, dragging himself through scenes like somebody functioning entirely on hatred and painkillers. That gives the film this exhausting quality that honestly helps it stand out. At the same time, though, the movie occasionally undercuts its own darkness with strange comedic energy. The neighbors, some of the one-liners, the bizarre hitman singing with a guitar. Even the Russian fight, as brutal as it gets, is also kind of hilarious in a chaotic comic book way. It's almost like the film is scared of becoming too oppressive for too long, so it keeps pulling itself sideways into weirdness. And I think that's why reactions to the movie are all over the place depending on what people wanted from it. Some viewers wanted a darker Marvel movie and got exactly that. Others wanted a truly disturbing psychological revenge story and felt the comic book elements softened the impact. Then there are people who expected a straightforward action film and got surprised by how miserable and angry the whole thing feels. Personally, I think the atmosphere is strongest when the movie just embraces its ugliness completely. Those moments where Frank feels less like a hero and more like a man decomposing emotionally in real time. That's where the film actually becomes interesting. Because beneath all the explosions and skull imagery, there's something kind of bleak running through the entire movie. Not sadness exactly, more like emotional emptiness. Like the world of the Punisher already gave up on itself before Frank Castle even picked up a weapon. And honestly, that bitterness is probably the movie's most memorable quality. What makes The Punisher interesting to me isn't really the action. I mean, yeah, the explosions are cool, the shootouts are brutal, the Russian fight is insane, all of that works. But the thing that actually sticks with me is how uncomfortable the movie occasionally becomes once you stop looking at Frank Castle like a normal action hero. Because the film keeps asking this question without fully saying it out loud. At what point does revenge stop being justice and just become another form of obsession? And honestly, I don't think Frank even knows the difference anymore. That's kind of the tragedy of the character in this version. His family gets massacred in such a horrifying way that you completely understand why he snaps. The movie earns that anger. Anybody watching can emotionally follow him to that breaking point. But then the revenge keeps escalating and escalating until Frank doesn't really resemble a grieving husband anymore. He becomes this walking mechanism built entirely around punishment. That's why I always find it funny when people casually group the Punisher together with normal superheroes, because Frank Castle isn't trying to save the world. He's not protecting society because he believes in hope or morality. Half the time it feels like he's just transferring his own pain onto other people in the most violent way possible. And the movie actually understands that better than some people give it credit for. There's this constant feeling that Frank crossed a line emotionally a long time ago. He doesn't just kill the people responsible for his family's deaths. He psychologically destroys them, manipulates them, humiliates them, breaks them apart from the inside. There's almost something disturbingly personal about the way he operates, like the scene where he tricks Howard Saint into believing his wife betrayed him. That isn't survival. That isn't self-defense. That's calculated emotional torture. Frank wants Saint to suffer before he dies. He wants him empty. And weirdly enough, that's where the movie gets closest to saying something genuinely interesting about revenge. Because Howard Saint and Frank Castle slowly start resembling each other more and more as the film goes on. Both are consumed by vengeance. Both destroy everyone around them because of grief. Both become emotionally hollowed out by hatred. The movie never fully dives into that parallel as deeply as it probably should have, but it's there underneath the surface. That's also why I think some viewers walked away feeling uncomfortable with the movie's violence, while others thought it wasn't harsh enough. The film is caught in this strange middle space where it wants revenge to feel cathartic, but also morally ugly at the same time. Sometimes that tension works really well. Other times the movie kind of backs away from its own darkness. There are moments where it almost feels scared to fully confront how terrifying Frank Castle actually is. Because if you really think about it, this guy is not emotionally healthy in any possible way. He's not healing. He's not recovering. He's not learning to move on. He's feeding his grief constantly until it completely replaces his identity. That's why the name The Punisher actually works better than most comic book names, honestly. It's not aspirational. It sounds cold, final, there's no warmth in it whatsoever. And I think the movie's strongest moments are when it remembers that, not when Frank is blowing things up in cool ways, not when the film leans into comic book spectacle. The best moments are the quieter ones, where you realize this man basically died alongside his family, and what's left walking around afterward is just rage-wearing human skin. The film doesn't always explore that idea with enough depth, which is probably its biggest weakness overall. You can feel the movie brushing against some genuinely dark psychological territory without fully committing to it. There's an almost fascinating version of the Punisher hidden inside this film somewhere, one that really examines revenge as emotional self-destruction instead of just action movie catharsis. But even in its uneven form, the movie still captures something a lot of revenge stories miss. Revenge here doesn't feel triumphant. It feels empty. Frank gets exactly what he wants by the end, and somehow it still feels like total spiritual collapse rather than victory. Thomas Jane as Frank Castle is one of those performances where your reaction to it basically determines whether the movie works for you or not. Seriously, if you don't buy him as the Punisher, the whole thing kind of collapses because the movie spends so much time just watching this guy silently walk around being emotionally destroyed. And honestly, I get both sides of the debate around him, because there are definitely moments where Jane feels almost too restrained, too quiet, too flat emotionally. Especially if you're expecting some huge explosive performance full of rage and screaming and dramatic breakdowns. That's not what he's doing here at all. Most of the time he barely reacts outwardly to anything. He speaks in this low, exhausted voice, stares into the distance a lot, and carries himself like somebody who hasn't slept properly in months. But weirdly, I think that's why the performance works for me. Frank Castle in this movie doesn't feel like a charismatic comic book antihero. He feels numb, like the emotional damage already happened before the revenge story even fully starts. There's this deadness behind Jane's eyes through most of the film that actually becomes kind of unsettling the longer the movie goes on. And physically, he absolutely looks the part. Not in the exaggerated superhero way where the guy looks genetically engineered in a lab. Jane feels grounded, worn down. He looks like somebody who's been punched in the face by life repeatedly and finally stopped caring about what happens next. The stubble, the tired expression, the slow, deliberate movement, it all fits the version of Frank Castle the movie is trying to create. What I also appreciate is that Jane never plays Frank like he enjoys being the Punisher. That's important. A lot of actors probably would have leaned too hard into the cool vigilante side of the character, but Jane mostly avoids that trap. Even during the action scenes, he rarely comes across like he's having fun. There's no swagger to him, no superhero confidence. Half the time he feels like he's operating purely on hatred and momentum. That said, I do understand the criticism from comic fans who wanted something more intense or physically imposing. Comic book Frank Castle is often portrayed almost like this mythic force of nature. Huge, relentless, borderline terrifying. Jane's version is more human and vulnerable, sometimes maybe too vulnerable. There are scenes where he gets beaten down so badly that he almost feels less like the Punisher and more like a really angry guy barely surviving one horrible week. But honestly, I kind of prefer that approach. Because when Jane finally does snap into full Punisher mode later in the movie, it feels earned. You've spent so much time watching this man emotionally decay that, by the time he fully embraces the vigilante identity, there's something genuinely uncomfortable about it. There's one thing I noticed rewatching the film too. Jane is actually carrying a lot of scenes purely through silence. Like, the script doesn't always give him incredible dialogue or deep monologues, but he's constantly selling Frank's internal exhaustion physically. The way he sits, the way he watches people, the way he reacts when the neighbors try talking to him, it feels like somebody forcing himself to remain functional, even though mentally he checked out a long time ago. That's probably why a lot of people still defend his version of the character so passionately years later. He may not be the most comic-accurate Punisher in every detail, but he feels emotionally believable within the world this movie creates. And honestly, I think time has been pretty kind to his performance. Back in the early 2000s, audiences were still expecting comic book leads to feel larger than life in a more traditional way. Looking at it now, though, Jane's quieter approach almost feels ahead of its time. Modern audiences are way more used to broken, emotionally damaged antiheroes than they were back then. Also, I can't lie, the voice helps. That tired, gravelly delivery shouldn't work as well as it does, but somehow it fits the character perfectly. He sounds like a man carrying around permanent emotional exhaustion. Even when the dialogue itself is simple, Jane gives Frank this constant underlying sense of pain that keeps the character from becoming just another generic action movie killer. Now, is it a flawless performance? No. There are scenes where the emotional restraint crosses into stiffness a little too much. A few moments where you wish Jane pushed harder emotionally instead of staying locked into that same low-energy intensity. But overall, I think he understood something really important about Frank Castle that a lot of adaptations miss. The Punisher isn't supposed to feel inspirational. He's supposed to feel tragic. John Travolta as Howard Saint is honestly one of the weirdest parts of this movie for me, because I can never fully decide whether he's perfectly cast or slightly miscast. Somehow both feelings exist at the same time while watching the film. Like, there are moments where he absolutely works, especially once the movie starts leaning into paranoia and emotional collapse later on. Travolta gets this cold arrogance early in the film that slowly starts cracking apart once Frank begins destroying his world piece by piece, and I actually think those scenes are where the character becomes interesting. But at first, he almost feels too smooth for the role. Howard Saint is supposed to be this terrifying crime boss whose name alone carries weight, and Travolta's version sometimes comes across more like a wealthy businessman playing gangster rather than a genuinely dangerous underworld figure. There's a polish to him that makes the character feel different from the more brutal, grounded energy the movie is going for elsewhere. At the same time, though, maybe that's intentional. Because Howard Saint isn't really portrayed like some street-level savage mobster. He's more like a powerful rich man, completely consumed by ego and revenge. And once his son dies, the guy basically detonates his own life emotionally. That's where Travolta starts finding something more compelling in the character. One thing I genuinely like is how personal his hatred toward Frank becomes. This isn't just business retaliation. Howard wants Frank emotionally destroyed. The movie makes that very clear. Wiping out the entire family isn't framed like strategic mob violence. It's pure grief mutating into cruelty. And honestly, Travolta sells that obsession pretty well. There's this constant sense that Howard Saint is barely holding himself together underneath the expensive suits and calm exterior. The movie doesn't always give him incredible dialogue, but Travolta knows how to play wounded pride. He makes Saint feel like a man whose authority depends entirely on control, which is why Frank's revenge strategy works so effectively later. Because Frank doesn't just shoot his way through Howard's empire. He humiliates him psychologically. That whole manipulation subplot, where Frank convinces Howard that his wife and best friend betrayed him, that's honestly one of the smartest things in the entire movie. And it only works because Travolta leans hard into the paranoia. You can literally watch Saint unravel scene by scene. The confidence starts disappearing. The rage gets messier. He becomes impulsive, emotional, reckless. And weirdly enough, by the final act, Howard Saint almost feels more emotionally unstable than Frank does. There's also something kind of fitting about casting Travolta specifically in this role, because he already carries all this cinematic baggage from previous gangster performances. The movie almost uses that audience familiarity against itself. You look at him and immediately think, yeah, okay, rich, dangerous crime boss. The problem is that sometimes the character feels too familiar because of it. Like there are scenes where Howard Saint doesn't entirely feel like a unique villain. He feels like John Travolta mobster character number 4. You can almost see traces of other performances bleeding into this one. Still, I don't think the movie actually needed an ultra-complex villain. Howard Saint works best as this symbol of corruption and vengeance mirroring Frank Castle himself. Both men lose family. Both react with violence. Both become emotionally poisoned by revenge. The difference is that Frank channels his grief outward with military precision, while Howard spirals into emotional chaos. That parallel honestly carries more weight than the movie fully realizes. I will say, though, some of the family dynamics around Howard feels slightly off. The age gap between Travolta and the actor playing his son feels weirdly small at times, which makes parts of the emotional setup slightly awkward if you think about it too hard. Not a huge issue, but definitely noticeable. Also, Laura Harring honestly brings more presence to some scenes than the movie seems prepared for. There are moments where Howard's wife feels more dangerous than he does emotionally, especially early on when revenge first enters the picture. But overall, I think Travolta gives the movie exactly what it needs structurally. A villain who can slowly emotionally disintegrate, while Frank stays emotionally frozen. And by the time the final act hits, Howard Saint no longer feels powerful at all. He just feels hollow, angry, desperate, which actually makes the ending work better because Frank isn't simply killing a crime boss anymore. He's finishing off a man revenge already destroyed from the inside. One of the strangest things about The Punisher is the supporting cast, because they almost feel like they wandered in from a completely different movie sometimes. And I don't even mean that negatively all the time. The film's side characters are a huge part of why the movie has this weird, uneven personality people still argue about years later. You've got Frank Castle sitting there emotionally dead inside, covered in bruises, building weapons in the dark like a revenge-obsessed ghost. And then suddenly, the movie cuts to these awkward, eccentric apartment neighbors trying to socialize with him like it's an offbeat indie comedy. It's honestly kind of bizarre at first. Ben Foster's Spacker Dave especially feels like he exists on an entirely different wavelength from the rest of the film. But weirdly, Foster commits so hard to the role that he becomes memorable anyway. He's got that early 2000s burnout energy where he constantly looks like he hasn't slept in 3 days and accidentally wandered into a Marvel movie while looking for a concert. And somehow, he works. Not because the character is deep or brilliantly written, but because Foster gives him this oddly genuine awkwardness. You can tell Dave wants connection, even though Frank clearly radiates, "Please leave me alone forever," energy every time somebody speaks to him. Rebecca Romijn's Joan is interesting because I can see exactly what the movie wanted her character to represent emotionally. She's supposed to be this small reminder that Frank still has some connection to humanity left. Somebody trying to pull him back toward being a person instead of a weapon. The problem is, the movie never fully figures out what to do with her. Romijn is likable enough, and there are moments where her scenes with Thomas Jane genuinely slow the movie down in a good way, but the character mostly exists around Frank rather than fully becoming her own person. You keep waiting for the film to give Joan something more substantial emotionally, and it never quite happens. Then there's Bumpo, who honestly feels like he escaped from a completely different genre altogether. I remember the first time watching the movie and being genuinely confused by how comedic some of these apartment scenes were compared to everything else happening in the story. You've got brutal executions and revenge murders in one scene, then awkward neighbor banter in the next. And yet, I kind of appreciate the movie for trying. Because without those side characters, Frank Castle would probably become emotionally unbearable to watch after a while. The neighbors create little pockets of warmth in an otherwise miserable film. Even when the humor doesn't fully land, you understand why it's there. The movie needs oxygen occasionally. It needs moments where Frank is forced into human interaction, whether he wants it or not. What's interesting is that those characters also accidentally expose how emotionally broken Frank already is. He barely knows how to respond to kindness anymore. Every conversation feels uncomfortable because he's emotionally disconnected from normal life at that point. The neighbors almost function like reminders of the humanity he lost. Will Patton, though, he's probably the best supporting performance in the movie. Seriously, Patton brings way more intensity and credibility to Quentin Glass than the film probably even deserves. There's this exhausted loyalty to the character that makes him stand out immediately from the other mob guys. He feels dangerous, but also deeply trapped inside Howard Saint's collapsing world. And honestly, Patton just has one of those faces that naturally belongs in grim crime thrillers. The guy looks permanently stressed in the best possible way. I also forgot Roy Scheider randomly shows up in this movie for a minute, which still feels surreal. He doesn't have a huge role, obviously, but his presence adds a little unexpected weight early on. The film smartly uses actors like Scheider to make Frank's family life feel slightly more grounded before everything collapses into revenge movie chaos. Then you've got characters like Harry Heck, the assassin with the guitar, who honestly shouldn't work at all, but somehow become weirdly memorable because the movie leans into the strange comic book Western energy. That character especially feels like something pulled out of an entirely different adaptation style. He almost feels mythic compared to the rest of the movie's grounded brutality. And that's really the best way to describe the supporting cast overall: uneven, strange, but memorable. Some viewers absolutely hate these characters because they think they interrupt the revenge story and kill the pacing. I completely understand that criticism, honestly. There are definitely moments where the side plots feel like detours away from the darker, material people actually came to see. But at the same time, I think the movie would feel emotionally emptier without them, because the supporting cast constantly reminds you what Frank Castle no longer knows how to be anymore: normal, connected, human. The tone of The Punisher is honestly all over the place, and somehow that's both one of the movie's biggest problems and one of the reasons people still remember it, because this film really cannot decide what kind of comic book movie it wants to be sometimes. There are scenes in this movie that feel genuinely grim, like uncomfortable grim. The family massacre alone sets this incredibly ugly emotional tone early on where you think, okay, this is going to be a cold, brutal revenge thriller. Frank Castle barely talks, people get tortured, the violence feels harsh and personal. The movie almost starts drifting into psychological revenge drama territory at points. Then out of nowhere, somebody makes a weird joke, or one of the neighbors starts acting quirky, or a giant Russian assassin crashes through a wall like a live-action cartoon character, and suddenly the whole vibe changes again. It's honestly kind of fascinating watching the movie struggle with itself in real time. You can feel it trying to balance comic book absurdity with grounded emotional brutality, and sometimes those two things clash really hard. Like the apartment scenes, for example. I actually don't hate them the way some people do, but they definitely feel like they belong in a slightly different movie. Frank Castle is over here processing catastrophic emotional trauma, while these eccentric neighbors keep barging into his life with awkward humor and random conversations. There are moments where it almost feels like the movie is nervous about staying too dark for too long, so it keeps throwing in weird comedy to break the tension. And honestly, I kind of get why. Because without those tonal shifts, The Punisher would probably become emotionally exhausting. The movie is already bitter enough as it is. If every single scene stayed locked into maximum misery and violence for 2 straight hours, it might have pushed people away completely. But at the same time, some of the humor genuinely doesn't work, or maybe doesn't fit is the better way to describe it. There are moments where the film undercuts its own emotional weight because it suddenly remembers it's technically based on a comic book and feels obligated to become quirky again. You'll have a genuinely disturbing revenge sequence, followed immediately by some oddball interaction or comic relief line that completely changes the atmosphere. The weird thing is, when the humor does work, it actually gives the movie personality. The Russian fight is probably the best example. That whole sequence is ridiculous. Frank gets thrown through walls, the fight becomes absurdly over the top, and at one point the movie practically turns into slapstick brutality. But it's memorable specifically because it leans into the chaos instead of pretending it's realistic. That's the side of the tonal imbalance I actually enjoy, because some comic book movies become so obsessed with appearing serious that they lose all individuality. The Punisher at least feels unpredictable, sometimes awkwardly unpredictable, but still unpredictable. There's also this strange dark humor running underneath parts of the movie that I think people overlook. Frank doesn't really crack Marvel-style jokes or anything like that, but there's a cold irony to some of the revenge methods he uses, especially when he starts psychologically dismantling Howard Saint's life instead of simply killing people outright. The film occasionally flirts with this almost twisted sense of satisfaction before snapping back into emotional emptiness again. And honestly, that tonal confusion kind of reflects Frank Castle himself if you think about it long enough. The guy isn't emotionally stable. The movie isn't emotionally stable either. It swings between grief, rage, absurdity, cruelty, and exhaustion, sometimes within the same 10-minute stretch. Now, does the movie fully pull that balancing act off? Not really. There are definitely scenes where it feels uneven in a bad way. Some emotional moments lose impact because the film keeps interrupting itself stylistically. And some comedic scenes feel like leftovers from an earlier draft where the movie was less grim overall. But I'd still take this kind of messy tonal experimentation over the overly sanitized tone a lot of modern superhero movies fall into now. Because at least The Punisher feels human in its imperfections. It feels like a movie made by people trying to figure out how dark a comic book film could become, while still keeping traces of pulpy comic book weirdness alive underneath all the violence. Sometimes that mixture works brilliantly, sometimes it completely clashes. Either way, though, it makes the movie harder to forget. Visually, The Punisher has this really interesting identity where parts of it look genuinely stylish, and other parts look like the movie is barely holding itself together financially. And weirdly, both sides kind of add to its charm, because this doesn't feel like a polished studio superhero movie. Not really. You can tell Jonathan Hensley came into this with a very specific mood in mind. The film constantly reaches for this grimy neo-noir revenge atmosphere where everything feels bruised, exhausted, sweaty, emotionally rotted out. Even the sunny Florida locations somehow feel depressing. That's honestly kind of impressive by itself. A lot of superhero movies from that era still had this glossy comic book energy where everything looked clean and heightened. The Punisher goes the opposite direction. The lighting's harsher. Interiors feel cramped. The color palette keeps drifting into these dirty browns, dark blues, faded grays. Nothing in the movie feels comfortable. And I think Conrad W. Hall's cinematography deserves a lot of credit for that. There are shots in this film that genuinely stick in your head afterward, not because they're beautiful exactly, but because they feel emotionally damaged. Frank Castle is constantly framed like somebody isolated from the rest of the world. Empty rooms, long shadows, neon reflecting off wet pavement. The movie keeps visually separating him from normal life even before he fully becomes the Punisher. There's also this old-school revenge western influence floating around the direction that I didn't fully appreciate years ago. You can feel the movie slowing down sometimes just to let tension sit there awkwardly. Characters stare at each other longer than expected. Conversations drag slightly on purpose. Frank wandering through parts of the movie almost feels like a gunslinger drifting through a modern crime world instead of a comic book antihero. And honestly, I kind of miss that pacing style in action movies sometimes. Now, is the direction consistently great? No, definitely not. There are moments where Henslay's inexperience as a director becomes pretty obvious. Some action scenes are staged in a very straightforward point camera at explosion kind of way. A few emotional scenes don't land visually as hard as they probably should have, and occasionally the movie struggles with scale. You can feel the budget limitations creeping into scenes that clearly wanted to feel larger and more cinematic. That's one thing you notice more on rewatch actually. This movie was trying to look bigger than it could afford. Certain sequences almost feel caught halfway between gritty realism and larger comic book spectacle because they didn't fully have the money to achieve either perfectly. Some explosions feel restrained. Some sets look smaller than intended. There are moments where the editing tries very hard to sell scale the production maybe couldn't entirely provide. But honestly, I kind of respect the ambition anyway. Because the movie still tries to create memorable visual moments even when it's operating within limitations. The Flaming Skull finale is the obvious example. It's over the top, slightly ridiculous, aggressively early 2000s, and completely unforgettable. The film knows that image matters for this character. Frank Castle isn't supposed to quietly finish revenge and disappear. The movie wants the violence itself to become symbolic. And I think that pulpy visual instinct helps the film survive some of its rougher filmmaking patches. There's also something refreshing about how physical the movie feels visually. Modern superhero films sometimes drown in digital smoothness, where every environment feels computer-generated and weirdly weightless. The Punisher feels dirty. People crash into actual walls. Rooms get destroyed. Frank limps around covered in sweat and blood, looking genuinely exhausted. Even when the action choreography isn't flawless, the movie still sells impact really well. I also like that the film rarely frames Frank like a traditional superhero icon. He's not constantly getting triumphant slow-motion hero shots with inspirational lighting blasting behind him. Most of the time, he's framed like a wounded animal lurking in dark corners, trying to survive long enough to finish revenge. That visual approach matters because it keeps the movie emotionally grounded even during its more ridiculous comic book moments. And honestly, I think the film's rough edges accidentally help its atmosphere sometimes. If The Punisher looked too sleek or too polished, it probably would have lost some of that bitter, ugly identity people still remember it for. The imperfections weirdly make the world feel harsher and more believable. It's not elegant filmmaking, it's not masterful directing all the way through, but it feels committed, and sometimes commitment leaves a stronger impression than perfection. The violence in The Punisher is honestly the thing that separates it the most from other Marvel movies of that era. And I don't just mean because there's blood everywhere. A lot of movies have blood. What makes this one feel different is how personal the violence feels. This movie doesn't treat action like spectacle first. It treats it like punishment. And yeah, sometimes that works really well. Other times it gets kind of uncomfortable in a way I'm not even sure the movie fully understands. Right from the beginning, the film sets this brutal tone with the family massacre. That whole sequence still hits harder than I expected revisiting it, not because it's super graphic compared to modern standards, but because of how cold it feels. The killings aren't stylized like a cool action montage. They feel cruel. Methodical, mean. That scene alone tells you this movie isn't trying to be a fun popcorn superhero adventure. And after that, Frank basically spends the rest of the film turning himself into a one-man revenge machine. What I actually appreciate is how physical the action feels compared to modern comic book movies. There's very little glossy CGI chaos here. People crash through real walls. Bodies slam into concrete. Gunshots feel heavy. Frank gets beaten up constantly. The movie makes sure you feel every injury. By the halfway point, he looks like somebody surviving entirely through painkillers, adrenaline, and unresolved trauma. That matters because it keeps the action grounded even when the movie gets ridiculous. And trust me, it absolutely gets ridiculous sometimes. The Russian fight alone feels like the movie suddenly remembered it came from comic books. 1 second we're in this grim revenge thriller. Next thing you know, Frank Castle is getting launched around his apartment by a human tank while boiling water and exploding furniture start flying everywhere. It's absurd. Completely absurd, but honestly, that fight rules, because the movie commits to it fully. Frank doesn't effortlessly dominate the guy either. He gets destroyed during that sequence. He struggles, panics, barely survives. The fight feels messy and desperate, instead of slick and choreographed within an inch of its life. That's kind of the recurring pattern with the action throughout the movie actually. Frank rarely looks invincible. He survives because he's stubborn enough to keep moving long after a normal person would probably collapse. At the same time, though, the movie definitely has this fascination with suffering that becomes hard to ignore after a while. And I don't just mean Frank's suffering. Everybody suffers in this movie. People get psychologically tortured, dragged through explosions, burned alive, stabbed, beaten, executed. The film constantly pushes violence toward cruelty rather than excitement. That's why reactions to the movie are so divided. Some people love how unapologetically harsh it is. They see it as a faithful representation of the Punisher's world, brutal, ugly, morally rotten. Others think the movie crosses into empty sadism, where it starts lingering on pain purely for shock value. Honestly, I kind of understand both reactions, because there are definitely moments where the film seems weirdly fascinated by punishment itself. Frank doesn't just kill people quickly most of the time. He wants them emotionally destroyed first. That's what makes him different from a normal action hero. He turns revenge into theater. The Howard Saint stuff especially gets dark in that way. Frank psychologically dismantles this man piece by piece before finally killing him. It's not enough for Saint to die. Frank wants him broken beforehand, and that's where the movie gets closest to becoming genuinely disturbing. What's interesting, though, is that the film never fully glamorizes the violence either. The action scenes are entertaining, sure, but there's usually this underlying bitterness underneath them. Frank doesn't look empowered afterward. He looks emptier every time. I think that's why the brutality works more often than it doesn't. Because underneath all the explosions and gunfire, the violence still feels connected to grief. Frank isn't fighting because he enjoys being a hero. He's fighting because emotionally, he has nothing else left. The movie understands that revenge doesn't heal him. If anything, it's slowly erasing whatever humanity he still had. Now, does the film always balance that perfectly? Definitely not. There are moments where the violence feels excessive just for the sake of looking edgy. A few scenes drift dangerously close to early 2000s, look how dark we are territory. And some emotional beats probably needed more restraint instead of bigger explosions. But honestly, I'd still take this kind of raw physical brutality over the sanitized, weightless action a lot of superhero movies fall into now. Because even when the Punisher goes too far, at least the violence feels like it has consequences. People bleed, people limp, people scream. Frank himself looks spiritually exhausted by the end of it all. And weirdly enough, that exhaustion is what gives the movie its identity. Okay, we need to talk about the Russian fight because this scene is probably the exact moment where the Punisher fully embraces its comic book insanity, and honestly, thank God it does. Because up until this point, the movie spends so much time being grim and emotionally miserable that when this gigantic bleach-blonde human refrigerator suddenly appears in Frank's apartment, the whole film almost snaps into another genre for 10 minutes. And somehow it becomes one of the best parts of the movie. The setup alone is hilarious in retrospect. Frank's exhausted, injured, mentally falling apart, barely functioning as a human being, and then Kevin Nash walks in looking like the final boss of a PlayStation 2 wrestling game. No subtlety whatsoever, just pure comic book madness entering the room. What I love is that the movie doesn't try to make the Russian realistic at all. This guy is basically a living cartoon character dropped into an otherwise grounded revenge thriller. He barely talks, he's absurdly huge, and he fights like somebody who physically doesn't understand the concept of pain. The entire sequence feels like the filmmakers suddenly remembered, oh right, this is based on a comic book, and decided to stop pretending otherwise for a while. But the reason the scene works isn't just because it's crazy. It works because the fight feels genuinely brutal underneath the absurdity. Frank gets absolutely wrecked during this sequence, and I mean wrecked. Modern superhero fights sometimes feel so choreographed and clean that you never really believe the hero's in danger. Here, Frank spends most of the scene trying not to die. He gets thrown through walls, smashed into furniture, choked, slammed around the apartment like a crash test dummy. There's this messy desperation to the whole thing that makes it weirdly tense even while the movie's being ridiculous. And honestly, the environment does so much work in this scene too. The apartment gradually turns into total chaos. Lamps explode, walls collapse, glass shatters, boiling water gets involved for some reason. people are screaming downstairs. It's like a Looney Tunes fight directed by somebody deeply angry at the world. The sound design helps a lot too, actually. Every impact feels heavy. Nothing about the fight feels graceful. It's just violence and survival and household destruction escalating minute by minute. What's funny is that this scene probably shouldn't fit the tone of the rest of the movie at all. On paper, it sounds ridiculous. A giant, nearly superhuman Russian assassin fighting a grieving vigilante in an apartment while opera music plays in the background. That sounds like a parody version of The Punisher, and yet it's memorable precisely because it's willing to go that far. I think this sequence exposes something important about the movie overall too. The Punisher is at its strongest when it stops trying so hard to be grounded and just leans into its pulpy comic book identity without embarrassment. Because the Russian fight still feels violent and painful, but it also has personality. It's not just another generic shootout. You remember it afterward. Honestly, most people who haven't watched the movie in years still remember that scene specifically. Kevin Nash deserves some credit too. The role obviously isn't built around deep acting or emotional complexity, but physically he's perfect casting. The guy genuinely looks terrifying standing next to Thomas Jane. There's this constant visual imbalance during the fight where Frank looks completely overmatched physically, which makes his survival feel more satisfying. And weirdly enough, the scene also humanizes Frank more than some of the emotional dialogue does. Because throughout most of the movie, Frank Castle feels emotionally frozen, but during this fight you see panic, frustration, exhaustion, survival instinct. He's improvising constantly because brute force alone clearly isn't enough. That vulnerability matters. Without scenes like this, Frank risks becoming too emotionally distant from the audience. The Russian fight forces him into chaos where he can't just stand there looking intimidating anymore. He has to survive like a normal human being trapped in a nightmare. Honestly, I think the movie needed more scenes with this kind of energy. Not necessarily giant cartoon assassins crashing through walls specifically, although I wouldn't complain, but moments where the film fully commits to being strange, brutal, and memorable at the same time. Because for a few minutes during that fight, The Punisher stops feeling like a conflicted revenge movie trying to balance tones, and just becomes gloriously insane. The pacing of The Punisher is honestly one of the biggest reasons people either really get into the movie or completely lose patience with it halfway through, because this thing moves in a very strange rhythm for a comic book film. It's not nonstop action, not even close, and I think that surprises people going back to it now, especially if they're expecting something closer to modern superhero pacing, where a major set piece happens every 7 minutes because the studio's terrified audiences might glance at their phones. The Punisher takes its time, sometimes a little too much time. There are stretches where the movie genuinely slows down and just sits with Frank Castle wandering around emotionally hollow, talking to neighbors, preparing weapons, silently drinking, staring into space, recovering from injuries. The film spends way more time on atmosphere and mood than I think some viewers expected back in 2004. And honestly, I kind of admire that about it. Because the slower pacing actually helps the movie feel heavier emotionally. Frank's revenge isn't treated like this quick, empowering montage where he instantly becomes an unstoppable comic book badass. There's this exhaustion hanging over everything. The film wants you to feel the time passing, the loneliness, the emotional emptiness after the massacre. That slower burn gives the movie some breathing room modern action films rarely allow themselves anymore. But at the same time, yeah, I completely understand why some people think it drags, especially in the middle section. There's a point where the film kind of settles into this repetitive rhythm of Frank hiding in the apartment, side characters wandering in and out, Howard Saint reacting angrily to things, then another small revenge setup happening. It doesn't completely lose momentum, but you can feel the movie circling around itself occasionally instead of driving forward. And I think part of the issue is tonal uncertainty. The movie keeps pausing the revenge narrative for character moments and weird comic relief, which either makes the pacing feel richer or slower, depending on your tolerance for those side characters. If you enjoy the strange atmosphere and the awkward human moments, the runtime flows much better. If you only care about the revenge plot, some scenes probably feel like detours. What's funny is that the film almost feels structurally closer to an old Western than a modern superhero movie. Frank doesn't immediately launch into constant action after becoming the Punisher. He observes people, plans things, waits, manipulates situations. There's patience to the revenge, which I actually think helps separate the movie from generic action flicks where the hero just shoots everybody immediately. Still, the movie probably could have lost maybe 15 minutes and become tighter overall. There are definitely scenes where you can feel the film indulging itself a little too long. some conversations linger past the point they need to. Certain side character interactions don't always add enough dramatically to justify the runtime they occupy. Even some emotional beats repeat the same idea multiple times. Frank is emotionally broken. The movie gets that point across pretty early, but then the third act arrives, and honestly, the pacing suddenly clicks into place beautifully. Once Frank fully starts dismantling Howard Saint's empire directly, the movie becomes way more focused. The tension tightens, the revenge setups start paying off one after another. The emotional manipulation, the shootouts, the destruction, suddenly everything starts moving with real momentum. And I think that strong final act is probably why so many people forgive the slower middle sections, because the payoff is genuinely satisfying. The movie doesn't end with some giant overproduced superhero climax either. It stays personal, angry, brutal. Frank's revenge feels methodical all the way to the end, and once the final confrontation starts rolling, the movie finally feels completely confident in what it wants to be. Honestly, rewatching it now, I think the pacing issues come less from the runtime itself and more from the movie trying to balance too many identities at once. Part revenge thriller, part comic book adaptation, part neo-Western, part psychological character study, part grindhouse-style action movie. Sometimes those elements blend together surprisingly well. Other times they kind of trip over each other and slow the momentum down. But I will say this. Even when the pacing gets uneven, the movie rarely feels manufactured. It feels like it's moving at its own pace, instead of following some studio-approved algorithm for audience retention. Ironically, that's probably why the film has aged better for some people. It's messy, it lingers too long sometimes, it wanders off into weird side moments, but somehow the movie earns it. Because the entire film has been building toward this weird mix of grounded brutality and comic book symbolism. The flaming skull is basically the moment where those two identities collide completely. It's excessive, theatrical, angry, and unforgettable in exactly the way the Punisher as a character probably should be. I also appreciate that the ending doesn't really pretend revenge healed Frank in any meaningful way. A lesser movie probably would have tried forcing some emotional closure onto the character, maybe a speech about peace or healing or finally moving on. But the Punisher understands that Frank Castle crossed too far emotionally for that kind of clean resolution. The revenge doesn't fix him. If anything, it finalizes his transformation into somebody who can no longer function normally outside violence. That's the real meaning of becoming the Punisher in this movie. It's not a superhero origin. It's the death of Frank Castle as an ordinary human being. And honestly, I think that's why the final act stays memorable, even when parts of the movie before it get uneven. Because once the ending arrives, the film suddenly feels fully locked into its identity. Brutal, bitter, slightly comic book ridiculous, emotionally empty in a very intentional way. It stops apologizing for what it is. And weirdly enough, that confidence makes the whole movie stronger retroactively. What's really interesting about The Punisher now is that the movie's reputation feels completely different compared to when it first came out. Back in 2004, it kind of existed in this awkward space where people didn't fully know what to do with it. It wasn't big enough to become one of those universally loved comic book movies, but it also wasn't bad enough to completely disappear. So it just sort of lingered there for years. And honestly, I think time helped the movie a lot. Because if you look at the early 2000s superhero landscape, most comic book films were still trying to figure out their identity. You had stuff leaning super campy, stuff trying to imitate Spider-Man, darker films trying to imitate Batman, random experiments that completely failed. It was messy. Studios hadn't fully cracked the formula yet. The Punisher came out right in the middle of that weird transitional era, and I think audiences maybe expected something different from it at the time, either more traditionally heroic or more explosively comic booky. Instead, they got this bitter revenge thriller where the main character spends most of the runtime emotionally decomposing while blowing holes through criminals, which honestly feels way more normal now than it did back then. That's probably the biggest reason the movie aged better for some people. Modern audiences are way more comfortable with damaged antiheroes now. We've had darker comic book shows, grim vigilante stories, morally broken protagonists everywhere. But in 2004, a Marvel movie this angry and emotionally ugly felt unusual, and I think people appreciate that more in retrospect. Now, obviously, the movie still has plenty of critics. Even fans admit it's uneven. Some people think the tone's a mess. Others think the film never fully reaches the emotional depth it's aiming for. Hardcore comic readers still debate whether Thomas Jane was the right Punisher. And honestly, those arguments probably aren't ever going away. But what's funny is that the movie's flaws are also kind of part of its identity now, because The Punisher doesn't feel manufactured. That's the word I keep coming back to with this film. It feels rough, personal, weirdly specific. You can sense filmmakers trying to make a harsh revenge movie inside a comic book framework before Hollywood fully turned superhero films into carefully calculated franchise products. And that sincerity matters. A lot of forgettable comic book movies technically function better than The Punisher. Better pacing, cleaner scripts, smoother tone, more polished visuals. But they leave your brain 5 minutes after they end because there's no personality underneath them. The Punisher absolutely has personality. It's bitter, excessive, sometimes awkward, occasionally kind of ridiculous, but memorable, very memorable. I also think the rise of the Netflix version of The Punisher helped people revisit this movie differently. Once audiences became more open to darker interpretations of Marvel characters, suddenly the 2004 film didn't seem so strange anymore. If anything, it started looking like an early attempt at the exact kind of morally ugly antihero storytelling comic book fans later embraced more openly. And honestly, I respect the movie more now because of that. Not because it's secretly a masterpiece or some misunderstood work of genius. It's not. The movie absolutely has weaknesses, but it takes swings, big swings. It tries combining revenge tragedy, comic book weirdness, grim action cinema, psychological damage, and pulpy violence all inside the same film. Sometimes it pulls that off beautifully. Sometimes it crashes headfirst into tonal chaos, but at least it leaves an impression. That's why people still bring up scenes from this movie years later. The Russian fight, the apartment atmosphere. The final act, the burning skull, Thomas Jane's exhausted performance. Even people who don't fully like the movie usually remember pieces of it very clearly. That's not accidental. Forgettable movies don't create cult audiences. Forgettable movies don't keep getting rediscovered by younger viewers online 20 years later. And they definitely don't keep generating debates over whether they were underrated or just deeply flawed in an interesting way. The Punisher somehow became both. And honestly, that's probably the most fitting legacy possible for a movie this messy, angry, and strangely committed to its own darkness.